Okay, so we are going to be talking about Plato today versus the Sophists, going back and looking at classical Greece and rhetoric. Most of you, if not all of you, have already had your course on the history of rhetorical theory, and so some of this will be a kind of review to you. But what I want to do is I want to provide you this lecture so that it will contextualize the reading that you're going to be doing when you read Plato's dialogues, Gorgias and Phaedrus. So this is a kind of context for that. So I'm going to start out by talking about the importance of our discipline in classical rhetoric, and then I'm going to move into what that looked like for the Greeks when they thought about rhetoric. And then I'm going to move into talking about Plato, Socrates, a tiny bit about Aristotle, and then talk about Plato's beef with the Sophists and what he didn't like about them, that kind of thing, who they were, and then briefly a little bit about these two dialogues that you're going to be reading, Gorgias and Phaedrus. And then finally, I'm going to mention to you or talk a little bit about your assignments in the class regarding these two dialogues. So that's what I want to do with my time with you here. I wish you were actually here with me. It's in the evening here at the university, and I'm in my office, and I would love to be able to engage my students back and forth as we move through this material. But at any rate, I'm imagining you here with me as I move into this discussion. First of all, I want to just say that many times students of communication, when they start the major, they don't realize the rich, complex, and wonderful history of our discipline that we can take pride in. And as you graduate, you go out into the world, whether it's to graduate school or out into a profession, I want you to know what a wonderful, rich heritage that we have. So many times I know students have said, yeah, I'll tell people I'm a communication major, and they'll say, oh, so what do you learn in communication? Everybody does that. So I want you to understand, if you don't already, and I hope you already do, but if you haven't really understood that, I want you to understand that our discipline has such a wonderful, wonderful heritage, and its importance goes back at least to classical Greece. So it goes back even further than that. But today we're focusing on classical Greece, and I hope that your takeaway with that, one of your takeaways, is just the importance, the richness of our discipline, and to know that it does go back to the philosophers and the rhetoricians who talked about and were trying to work out the kinks of what is rhetoric and what is it not, and that kind of thing. That conflict, that discussion, that debate has been raging down through the years, down through the ages to now. And we still have these discussions and debates about it, which is wonderful because that's how we all learn and grow, is from engaging in those discussions and debates. So that's the first thing I want you to really get from this, a big takeaway. Okay, so who were the Greeks? Well, I'm just going to briefly focus on this, but the Greeks were obsessed with individual perfection of the mind and the body. And they talked about this in terms of telos, T-E-L-O-S, telos. So that was the appearance of excellence. And for the Greek, that was both in mind and body. And that's why back when the Greeks were around and they had the Olympics didn't just focus on physical prowess or physical power and beauty and strength the way we think of the Olympics now in current times, but it was that, but it also was not only the body, it was the mind. And there were rhetorical events, there was oratory, and great speakers would compete in these oratories that were part of the Olympics. And so it was very, very important. So for the Greek, this excellence was something that all young men should aspire to. And notice I say young men, because young women during this time did not go to learn and develop their minds that way. Young men who had money, the means from wealthy families, were especially able to learn and develop their minds. And so that was very, very important to them. So when they talked about the mind, the body, they were talking about men at the time. Anyway, so to be a good speaker, the idea was that you should be someone, a man of honesty, intelligence, and goodwill, or at least appear to be. Now notice I keep saying the appearance of excellence. For the Greek, the idea was we can't really know what's inside a person's heart and soul and mind or whatever, but what we see is the appearance of these things, of character, of goodwill. So what do they appear to be? And actually, I teach that. Those of you that have had me in rhetorical criticism class, I even say that. I say we could speculate all day about what this speaker or this artist or this musician or whoever, we could speculate all day what their motives are in terms of their own thinking and within themselves, but we're never really going to know. But what we can do is talk about what motives do they communicate to their audience. What does the audience get from that speech or that musical event or whatever it is, dance, it could be anything. That's a form of communication. And so that's something that the Greeks dealt with as well. Just like we're still talking about these kinds of things today, they were talking about them then. So this was something, and by the way, this was true for the Greeks, whether you were talking about religion or whatever you're talking about. So for religion, they were very big on ritual and procession. You know, these beautiful events where you pomp and ceremony. We just had an inauguration of the President of the United States, and there's all this symbolism and ritual that goes on. And so for the Greeks, this was all very, very important because, again, this was an appearance of religious importance. It was an appearance of that, telos. So all the citizens were expected, when we talk about rhetoric, all young men were expected to join in the assembly debates, the political debates on topics such as war and peace, finance, legislation, etc. So all young men were to develop their speaking abilities and be able to be persuasive in the halls of politics, if you will. So again, telos there. And so for the young man, they were to develop all these different areas of their mind and their body in this world in which they lived. So this was something very, very important. So the citizen learned 3 valuable skills when it comes to speaking. First, to speak well, or rhetoric, to speak well. Second of all, to listen critically to the arguments of others. And third, to utter an appropriate response. That's what we teach today. Communication is transactional, right? So I speak to you, and then you speak to me, and I listen to what you have to say, and then I respond to that. There's a follow-up. So this idea that we engage back and forth, that it's a kind of transaction, you could argue was already being thought about and spoken about during this time period. So now we get to certain people of this time that were very, very important. So I often will start class, if you were here with me, I'd say, who came first, Socrates or Aristotle or Plato? And here's the way it works. Socrates was first, and he was the teacher of Plato, and Plato was the teacher of Aristotle. And they were all philosophers of this time period. And with Socrates, we do not have any of his surviving works, his words. We have nothing of him. The way we know Socrates is through his student, Plato. That's how we know Socrates, would be the writings that Plato wrote. So I often tell students not to sound arrogant. I'm comparing myself to Socrates, but I guess I am. It would be like if one of you were taking notes in class, and then in my class, and then you went out and you were trying to communicate to another group of people, another group of students possibly. Here is what Hamburg taught. This is what I learned in Hambrick's class. This is what Hambrick believed. And you would put forth those ideas. So my ideas would come through my student rather than directly through myself. So we do not have any writings from Socrates, but we do know Socrates through Plato. Okay, so Plato was born about or around 427 to 429 BC. That, I'm not going to bring that up to you later in terms of you have to memorize that or anything. It's just to give you some context, place in history. He was born to a very wealthy family with aristocratic connections. He grew up in some of the most dark and turbulent years in Athens history. And he wrote many dialogues that survive today. Now, we call them dialogues, and that's really what they were. They were conversations that occurred in the dialogues, between Plato's teacher, Socrates, and one of the sophists. Now, I'm going to develop that in a minute, but right now we're focusing on who was Plato and what did he do, and then we'll talk about who the sophists were. But he would write these dialogues, and in the dialogues, Socrates, Plato's teacher, would have these dialogues, or you could argue they were kind of debates, with the sophists. And so he wrote many dialogues, and we have them. They have survived down through the years. And he also not only wrote these dialogues, but he founded a school that was called the Academy. And he taught mathematics and philosophy there. He had two famous pupils. One was Demosthenes and the other was Aristotle. And I mentioned that already. We have Socrates and Plato and Aristotle. It comes third. These are important for us in terms of our discipline, in terms of rhetoric and our history. They're very important. Okay, so Plato really disliked the sophists. Well, why did he dislike the sophists? First of all, let me talk about who they were, and then we'll talk about why he didn't like them. Okay, so the sophists were, you could argue, teachers of their day. They taught young, rich men to give effective or persuasive speeches in the political assemblies and law courts. And they were itinerant in that they didn't live in one place. They traveled from one Greek city-state to another, teaching these young men basically rhetoric. You could argue, in a way, I'm a sophist of contemporary times. I teach rhetoric. And the sophists of their time taught young men rhetoric. So they were itinerant, they never stayed in one place, and they charged fees to these young men when they taught them. So they did charge money for their teaching that they provided them. They taught rhetoric, they taught persuasive speaking, and they were most concerned with effectiveness, being persuasively effective. So they were interested in, what kind of topics would persuade a jury. Any argument that persuaded would be acceptable. So the sophists taught their students to be able to argue both sides of an issue well. What's the equivalent of that today, I would ask you? Lawyers, right? Good lawyers if I was a lawyer, I could take a case on this one side, go into court, argue passionately and with all these wonderful arguments in court against the other side, and at the end of the day, my opponent, the other attorney for the other side, and I could say, oh, let's go get a beer. That was great, right? Because the idea is that if I'm a good attorney, I can argue either side and I do it well. I give it the best I can. So you hired me this time to represent you. The next time, the person you're up against might hire me. So a good lawyer can argue both sides of the issue well. That is what the sophists taught these young men, that you must be able to argue both sides of a situation well. Now, there are some what we might call star sophists of their time. So some of these were Protagoras, Isocrates, Gorgias, and Phaedrus. Now, those last two should be familiar to you because that's what you're going to be reading this time. You're going to be reading two dialogues, which one, Phaedrus, is going to be Socrates in discussion, dialogue, debate with Phaedrus. In Gorgias, Socrates is going to be doing or having a dialogue or debate with another sophist, which is Gorgias. And in fact, in Gorgias, he argues with 4 different sophists, but one of them is Gorgias. So Plato writes about Socrates taking on these different sophists in these dialogues, and these were considered famous sophists, the ones I just mentioned: Protagoras, Isocrates, Gorgias, and Phaedrus. Okay, so what was Socrates' problem with the sophists? And you could say ultimately Plato's problem, because Plato was Socrates' student who wrote about what Socrates taught. You're still following me, I'm hoping. So what was Socrates and therefore Plato's problem with the sophists? Okay, well, here's the problem. Socrates was interested in the power of words. In that, he was similar to the sophists. The sophists also too, are interested in the power of words, but that's where the similarities stopped. Plato pictured Socrates, his teacher, as the chief opponent of the sophists. And why was that? Because Plato believed, remember I said that sophists took money for their teaching. Plato believed that a true philosopher should never take money for their teaching. They should offer what they know, their knowledge, wisdom, all these different things that they bring to the table. That is priceless. It's priceless. You can't put a monetary value on it. So it cheapens that. That's what Plato thought. Now, the sophists could say, well, yeah, it's easy for him to say. He comes from a wealthy family. He doesn't need to make a living. But that was one of the problems that he had with them, and ultimately Socrates as well. Also, Socrates did not claim to have special knowledge. He preferred the question and answer method or dialectic method rather than lecture to use when teaching. So thus the dialogues, you're going to see they're going to be going back and forth with questions and then answers. And that's the dialectic method that Socrates believed was the best way to learn. And so that was where he was very different than the sophists as well. He was skeptical about the role of rhetoric. He left no writings. We're familiar with him, like I said, through Plato. So Plato wrote these dialogues where Socrates was the chief protagonist. And in them, Socrates would take on a particular sophist. And in the end, after debate and discussion, his would be the reasonable alternative or answer to the issues being discussed. Okay, so now back to what were the problems that Plato had with the sophists. First of all, they took money for teaching. Philosophers should share the truth with anyone. It's immoral to take money for that. Second of all, he thought they were show-offs at the Olympics. Remember I said that there were speaking events at the Olympics, and many of the sophists were some of the best speakers at the Olympics. And Plato thought that's showing off. You should not do that. So that's a bad use of rhetoric, ultimately. Third, he believed that they did not seek absolute truth. That because they said we should teach our students to argue both sides well, they weren't standing for something that was truthful, taking a position that's truthful. And Plato's idea was that you only speak what you believe the truth to be, and it's based on nature and natural laws that we have. So his biggest beef with them, though, was that they pulled the wool over young men's eyes, basically. He believed that they were teaching young men to manipulate their audience. Now, that argument is still raged today. You hear people all the time, right? Saying, oh yeah, they're trying to be a used car salesman, or, you know, how many lawyers does it take, you know, at the bottom of the ocean, jokes we tell, because the idea that being a lawyer or being a used car salesman, or these are, you know, very stereotype examples I'm giving to you, but you get my point, that we make this, or politicians, that they're using words to manipulate, to coerce, and they are using it in a way that is unethical. They're not telling the truth. So these were Plato's beefs with the sophists. Okay, so now specifically Gorgias and Phaedrus. I'd like to talk about the sophists, Gorgias and Phaedrus, just a little bit, again, for context for what you're going to be reading. Okay, Gorgias lived between 485 and 380 BC during the same time as Protagoras, and he was another sophist, as I mentioned. Gorgias was successful as a diplomat, a teacher, philosopher, and speaker. He was a great professional persuader as well, and his ability to persuade was actually legendary. He believed in the power of words over the mind, and he believed, quote, rhetoric's ability to make men its slaves by persuasion, not force. So he believed in rhetoric's ability to make men its slaves by persuasion, not force. He was interested in rhetoric in terms of style and linguistic ornamentation. In other words, saying things beautifully. He loved the use of words to make beautiful, poetic kinds of statements. So his own ability with regard to ornamentation was legendary. He was known for his beautiful use of style and the Greek language, and his speeches were filled with poetic devices. But critics like Plato and others who did not like him or his work argued that what he did was like putting a knife in the hands of a madman in a crowd. That's interesting, especially in light of recent events and the idea of the power of social media and people coming to believe things and then acting on them in ways that can be very violent and disruptive in a culture. And so it's interesting that that was used to describe him, and that could be used to describe people today, you could argue. So putting a knife in the hands of a madman in a crowd, that's what it was like to teach rhetoric, the use of persuasion to manipulate. Okay, so Gorgias and Protagoras were considered the two of the greatest sophists. And so now, why are we talking about Protagoras? Because I want to compare Protagoras to Gorgias, because they represent the two different thoughts about rhetoric. So I want to provide those to you. Okay, Protagoras, briefly describing him, was born 485 BC to 410 BC. He was a teacher and he was a scholar. He believed that taking two sides, remember I told you sophists believe in taking two sides of an issue. So in that way he was like Gorgias and Phaedrus and other sophists. He believed that taking two sides of an issue was ethical because what might seem false to one man might seem true to another. He did not believe in absolute truth or authority. His most famous saying was, "Man is the measure of all things." And he's called the father of debate. Again, the idea that he believed in arguing both sides well. Okay, so Gorgias and Protagoras represent the two lines of sophist thinking. So they were both in agreement that it is not possible to measure things by some objective truth out here, because objective truth is inaccessible to us. So a rhetor must take both sides of an argument and decide which is best. So both of them started from that premise. They both believed in that, but then that's where they diverged after that. So the difference is this. Protagoras believed that two sides of a question must be brought to bear on each other to effect some resolution of the issue at hand. So two sides come together in a dialogue or debate, and you work through a discussion back and forth, a resolution of the issue, and he believed that this was a reasonable way to deal with the potential for force or the potential for deception. So you come together, you argue both sides, and you're transparent, you share those sides, and then you work out together what is the best resolution. So you bring the issue into the open and you have a dialogue. That was Protagoras' one line of view as a sophist. Gorgias, on the other hand, believed that the power of speech cannot be overestimated, and that speech is a powerful lord. That's a quote from him. Speech is a powerful lord. So He believed that the effect of speech upon the condition of the soul is comparable to the power of drugs over the nature of bodies. So his view was that rhetoric is best where there's a transaction between an active speaker and a passive audience. So the speaker casts a spell on the audience, and persuasion is stimulus response. So in other words, for Gorgias, the speaker has power to effect change and persuasion over a passive audience, versus Protagoras, who believed that you have two sides come together, reason back and forth, and have a dialogue, and then decide which is the best way to go. So Gorgias was a rhetorician, and he was in Olympic events, as I mentioned to you before, and he was excellent at, they could throw out a word, and then he would quote phrases from that one word and craft these beautiful speeches. So he dazzled people with what he could recall. And Plato didn't like him. He said he wasn't a searcher for truth. He wasn't a serious philosopher. He was just a speaker who dazzled people. He was a show-off. Those are still some of the arguments raging today, right? You can think of all kinds of politicians that people say things like that about. And social dissenters, etc., that those kinds of things are said about. So in Gorgias, the dialogue that you're going to be reading, Plato's Socrates, his teacher, is going to take on Gorgias and his beliefs, his teachings about rhetoric. So Plato's Socrates shows that rhetoric has nothing to do with justice or virtue. Rhetoric is not truly useful and is dangerous, and it's just simply a form of flattery. So Socrates characterizes Gorgias' students as unscrupulous seekers after political power, and they cater to the base pleasures of juries and other mobs. That's a quote. So the points that Plato makes through Socrates is that rhetoric must have substance, and one must speak the truth as one believes it to be. Also in this dialogue, Socrates talks about rhetoric being a knack versus a true art. Now, I don't want to go into this any more than this, other than, because that's your job, is to figure out what, and let me just say this, in these two dialogues, what I want you to look for is, what is Plato saying that Socrates says rhetoric is and isn't, what it should be, what it shouldn't be. Those are the kinds of things you are to pull out of these two dialogues. You are to focus on what is being said about what rhetoric is and its relation to other things around it, like justice, etc. Okay, so I don't want you to go off on philosophical arguments about justice in the dialogues or things like that. I want you to stay focused throughout the dialogues as you read them on what are we learning about rhetoric, about what Socrates said it was and should be versus what the sophists were saying it is and should be, that kind of thing. Okay, so then there's Phaedrus, and that was written later than Gorgias, and it's allegorical. So in other words, here he's not talking about rhetoric directly, but rather he is talking about lovemaking, and he talks about there's three lovers. He talks about the evil lover, the noble lover, and the lover that fails to move you at all. But it's allegorical for rhetoric, for speech making, being persuasive. So again, I want you to figure out what is Plato through Socrates, who he's have these dialogues with these sophists. What does he say? What do they say about lovemaking? Ultimately, they're talking about speech making, and what can we learn from those dialogues? So basically, Protagoras, Gorgias, and Plato's perspectives were all three a response to the social and political conditions in Athens at the time. So remember that the Greeks were interested in the appearance of perfection. So rhetoric is a subject that should have this perfection of style and technique, you could argue, versus that would be the sophist view, versus Plato's view, which is that rhetoric as being done by the sophists is a kind of pseudo art of appearances rather than a vehicle for conveying truth. Okay, so then, of course, Aristotle came along, Plato's student, and Aristotle began his own school, the Academy, which he had for 20 years, and he tutored Alexander the Great, who was a conqueror and hero who was very much able to persuade his troops and his people. And Aristotle was his tutor or his mentor. And Alexander the Great, like Hitler, was not only a conqueror, but he developed skills of persuasion so that he could manipulate his military and his people. So Aristotle was his teacher, and he was himself a brilliant scholar and I said a while ago Aristotle founded his school, the Academy. I'm confusing you. It was Plato that started the school, the Academy. I already told you that earlier. Aristotle started his school, the Lyceum. I apologize for that. But Aristotle disagreed with his teacher, Plato. Plato said that in order for something to be an art, it has to have a focus of study, and rhetoric has no identifiable study of its own. But Aristotle came along and said, yes, it does. Rhetoric can be studied systematically. Rhetoric is the study of all the available means of persuasion, or the art of persuasion. So rhetoric is the seeking out all the available means of persuasion. So at any rate, Aristotle was then the first to give us an orderly, systematic attempt at principles of an art of rhetoric. So in conclusion to all of this, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and the Sophists, in all of their ways, directly impacted how we began to think about rhetoric in terms of our discipline. And these perspectives have come down through the centuries and still influence our wonderful and rich discipline that we take forward into the world. So it's going to be your job to know and understand these perspectives and be able to persuasively communicate them to the people around you in your work, your community, and your world. You'll have an opportunity to do this by converting either Phaedrus or Gorgias into a TED Talk, ultimately, and that's going to be really fun. So, okay, so I got to grab something. Oh, it didn't come off the printer. All right, so I just got to be able to remember what I wanted to say about this then, because I evidently don't have it here. Yeah, I don't. Oh, is that here? No, I don't. All right, so I'm just going to have to wing it and remember. All right, so I've given you context for these two dialogues. So now what I want you to do is I want you to read them first, okay? Now, some of it you're going to even laugh. I read them, and Socrates is funny. There's times when, and the Sophists can be really funny. There's times you're going to laugh. You're gonna go, wow, I can't believe they were talking about these things then. It feels like it's right, that we could be talking exactly about what's going on around us today, listening to them talk. And then other times you're going to be reading, you're going to go, what? What was that? All right, stick with it when that happens. What I do that helps me is sometimes I get to those sticky parts too, and I'll read it and I don't understand it. Go back and read it again, that little section. Once you read it a couple of times, it'll start getting through to you. Oh, that's what they're saying. Okay, so I want you to read Phaedrus and Gorgias. Then your job is going to be to outline each of those dialogues. So I want you to create typed sentence outlines for them. And what I want you to do is when you create those outlines, I want you to write about what is Plato saying about rhetoric. That's always what you're trying to develop. Sometimes in the dialogues they talk about other things. They go off and talk about justice, and they talk about a civil society and different things that are very, very important. And your job is, well, but what are those things is Plato saying about rhetoric and rhetoric's role in our world around us? So outline from that perspective. We're looking at those dialogues in terms of rhetoric. So you're going to be outlining on the one hand what is Socrates saying, and what is the particular sophist saying in conflict with that. Okay? So you're going to outline those, and each of those outlines will be worth 50 points and 20 points of each of the 50. So like you're going to do gorgeous outline and get 50 points for it. 20 of the points you can get simply by either virtually setting up an appointment with the Comm Lab or coming in person to the Comm Lab, either way you want to, and have a consultant sit with you and look at your outline and say, yeah, that looks good, that looks clear to me, that's well developed. And 20 of your points on each of those outlines can be received by doing that. So you are going to create those outlines. Then I'm going to provide another short lecture about what a TED Talk looks like, okay? I can tell you right now, just so you can start thinking about it, your TED Talk is going to be 10 minutes. Typically, TED Talks are 20 minutes, but we're going to keep them at 10. And so you're then going to take your outline and decide to you can either decide to do your TED Talk on just some of the points Socrates makes, or you can focus on several of the points the sophists make, or Socrates in conflict with the sophist on a couple of particular points. But realize you're going to have to really get in specific for your TED Talk. There's no way you're going to be able to cover the entire dialogue in 10 minutes. So you're going to have to really narrow your focus down and make it clever and interesting and fun and have visuals. PowerPoint visuals with your TED Talk kind of thing. And then those will be due, and that's going to be, and you're going to choose one of the dialogues to do your TED Talk on. So you're doing 2 outlines, one on Phaedrus, one on Gorgias, 2 outlines, but you're only going to do 1 TED Talk. And that's going to come from one of those outlines that you did, and you're going to develop a TED Talk. And then you're going to perform the TED Talk. So in other words, I will give you a short lecture on what it looks like, what you need to know about it, and then you're going to actually create it and then perform it and turn that in, and that's 150 points. I am then going to select 3 of the best in the class to be presented at this event we're going to have. That's going to be both virtual and in person, where one of the philosophy classes, senior seminar classes, they're going to select the 3 top ones from their class, and we're going to bring the 3 from ours, and then our class will be part of the audience for that event. So I've already mentioned that in my earlier lecture. I'm mentioning it to you again now, so you plan that, you put that on your schedule, and you start thinking about what that's going to look like. And as you develop your ideas, if you want to use me as a sounding board, that's what I'm here for. So please, do that. That's what I want to do. I want to provide you all the help you need, and I want this to be fun and exciting and learning, something that you're going to take with you and be very proud of. Because part of your job is, as you go forth, to communicate to the world around you, the role of communication, where it has come from, where we want to go as a society. And that's part of your job, your responsibility, to be able to carry that forth. That's it for today, folks. I hope you're having a good time in this class, and I will look forward to talking to you next time.